morning, everyone. My name is Shelly Jung, and I'm going to talk about the relationship between bilingualism and Alzheimer's disease today. For acknowledgement, I would like to thank Dr. Phelan, my INDS and academic advisor, and Dr. Ranj from Erickson School, and Dr. Mujib from INDS and also Integrates Institute. And both of them are my research mentor who helped tremendously throughout the process. And Dr. Ravens and Mrs. Wolf, those who are faculty member here at UMBC who taught me the research method and outline. And last but not least, INDS faculty and staff family. They were really supportive all the way through my 4.5 years. Before I go on further, I would like you to take a moment and imagine that you're in the middle of a foreign country, that you don't really know their culture and language. How would you feel? You might be curious or even surprised in the beginning, but as you go on, you will become frustrated because you don't really understand their language and their cultural context. On top of that, if you have cognitive problem or the memory problem, it will be worse, right? And this is how a Korean lady felt in the nursing home when I was visiting a nursing home for the volunteering or shadowing opportunity. And I noticed that she reacted differently to different languages. And this story is the inspiration for this project and how I saw it. Initially, my plan was based on the experimental approach with its own research method. But in the middle of the semester, I had to take different paths. And it was because of my challenge that I faced with communicating with my mentors. And with a thorough discussion, I decided to have two different products for my capstone project. First one is synthesis paper, and the second one is reflection paper. I would like to start with the synthesis paper. The purpose is to study the relationship between late bilingual background and the cognitive level of elderly people with Alzheimer's disease in a long-term care facility. Why does it matter? As I mentioned in my personal story, I noticed the communication barrier in a long-term care facility is increasing. Also, according to Alzheimer's Association, it is projected to increase up to about 88 million by 2050. The people in the United States have Alzheimer's disease. And also, as you can see here in the UMBC also, that there's a growing diversity of racial or ethnic composition of the United States population. So through my experience, I learned that Alzheimer's disease is not a simple entity. It's a complex concept that includes not just the clinical aspect, but also social, mental, and cultural wellness of the patient. In order to study this topic, I used different disciplines. The first one is neurobiology. This gave me understanding of physiological and biochemical backgrounds of this neurodegenerative disease. And then second field is called management of aging services, which gave me the foundation of the concept called person-centered care and individualized care in a long-term care facility. This concept is to put a resident in the center of care planning process and incorporates all different factors, not just the clinical one. And the third one is linguistic. This is to gain the understanding of linguistic behavior. And the last one is the psychology. It gave me understanding of the clinical manifestation of the disease. And also this theory of cognitive reserve, which is the central theory of my project. It explains how different factors influence the capacity of brain to deal with the damage and mitigate its cognitive burden on the individual. And it all integrates together to address the topic in the middle. This is my concept map. I use different bridging strategies of Miller and Boykinsia. The first one is building complex multi-causal explanation, which is to borrow key concepts from each discipline and build a comprehensive and complex explanation for the paradigm of care planning in a nursing home. And I intentionally grouped the two disciplines together on that side and the other two on this side in order to compare the traditional model, which is really the traditional hospital setting medical model of care, which focus on medication and medical part of the residents. But on the other side, it is based on the culture change that is based on emphasizing the person-centered or individualized care, which respect the preference of the individual or lifestyles or any cultural background. So through advancing through checks and balances, I use different perspectives to check the discipline's bias and gain more comprehensive understanding. The research method that I use for synthesis paper is the literature review and one of the academic course here at the NBC for using AOK library database mainly. Also, through INDS 399 course, I learned the basic skill to search the relevant article and journal through the database. And also, through this course, I learned the unique culture of care in a long-term care facility. And also this course included the project that designs my own approach to care management. So I was able to narrow it down to 5 studies, and all those studies supported that bilingualism is a form of cognitive reserve variable, which means it mitigated the cognitive burden on the people with both bilingual background and Alzheimer's disease. But there is some limitation that I needed to consider, and I'm going to talk about it further in the next slide. And according to one of the studies, the delay of 4 years in onset can be interpreted into 47 degrees in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. And the person with bilingual background and Alzheimer's disease show faster deterioration of the second language. So in the case of the Korean lady that I met, she would have Korean language intact compared to the English, her second language. So as the disease goes further, and she will also have decline in the first language, but it will be slower than compared to the second language. And then all this finding implies that clinical implementation of culturally sensitive care and communication strategy for diverse population in the long-term care facility. So the studies that I used took retrospective approach, which relied heavily on the medical records and the interviews with the participant or caregiver. This has inherent bias to it. So the process had challenges in randomizing the sampling the participants, which can have the confounding effects. So I would suggest the next step is to adopt experimental approach which can randomize the groups, and that can reduce the confounding effects of the confounding factor, which can include education, occupation, and second language acquisition. So here, second language acquisition, I found that the time period when you learn the second language can have an impact on the level of the advantage the bilingual have in terms of executive function. So that can influence on the results of the studies. So that's one of the important factors to be controlled. My second project is reflection paper. The purpose was to thoroughly reflect, take time to think about the challenges or issues that I had throughout the project, and through that process, I would identify my weakness and strength that is based on the effective domain of the education. And the research method was qualitative data analysis, and part of that was coding process. It was to recognize the pattern or main theme of unstructured diary of the reflection that I had. For this project, I had 3 different disciplines: education, psychology, and sociology. And the main concept was effective learning, which emphasizes on learning the behavioral, emotional skills in education process, which to develop a healthy connection or relationship. and also social and emotional learning that emphasize the community activity, applied learning. The major theme here that I found was the challenges of communication within the interdisciplinary team, and I identified these four key concepts, core competencies based on the effective learning, and then the pie chart shows the proportion of these competencies found in my reflection paper, and I would focus on the interpersonal education and resilience and adaptability in the future. In conclusion, although initially my plan diverged and didn't took the path that I intended, but this was a huge learning opportunity for me, and identifying weakness and strengths are some of the unique opportunity that I couldn't have if I didn't do this project. And further, I would like to apply that competency that I identified, something that I can improve on. I would like to focus on those to my future professional career. Thank you so much.
Shelly, question about the Aging 310 course. What's the title of it? What's the course actually?
It's overview of management of aging services. So it provides broad knowledge on the care for the nursing resident in the nursing home. So it's a management of, like, some of the example were talking about the regulation for the dining services and how it can be improved based on the person-centered concept.
So you're talking about somebody who's bilingual, but one of the languages is acquired relatively late in life.
Right.
I was wondering if you found any studies that talked about people who were multilingual much earlier in life, and whether or not you saw any differences in degradation later.
So throughout the process, I came across different studies with some of them were addressing the multilingual parts, which would be like having more than 2 languages. That can be influencing on the results. Having more language would have different advantage, but there's not much research done focusing on that part yet. So I wasn't able to learn like more about that, but I think that will give different results later if there's further research on. And also the early bilingual, which means learning two different languages together in parallel from the birth, and then late bilingual, is typically after age 5 they learn second language. So the research paper was mentioning that if you learn the early in your life, like from the birth, it can have more advantage. But later on in the paper, it is addressing that it can be different domain of cognitive function or executive function.
Did you see any differences between things like Alzheimer, dementia, or other neurodegenerative diseases? Is there any research that kind of points there?
I was mainly focusing on Alzheimer's and then dementia in general, but I couldn't get into the further details into different dementias.
So, in the studies that you've looked at, is there any sense of what kind of causal mechanism might be at play here? What's going on in the brains, or do folks just really have no idea yet, and they're just trying to measure the effect?
So the general body of research is saying that it's abnormal accumulation of protein in your brain. The 2 of specific example is amyloid protein and the tau protein. It's forming the plaque and tangle in your brain that interferes with the communication between 2 different neuron cells. That can contribute to abnormal cell death in your brain, and that specifically reason for its Alzheimer's disease, it's forming new memory. So that can be damaged, and the initial significant symptom could be difficulty with forming new memory, short-term memory. So they will have relatively intact long-term memory, which is from their childhood, but where they put the key or where they're going like for simple direction to different places, that can be interfered initially.
Well, part of what I meant though is why would bilingualism have any impact and given that description that you just gave of perhaps what's going on in Alzheimer's patients, why would bilingualism have any effect?
So, in general, it is shown that bilingual have advantage in executive function by having this unique cognitive demand, which is to interfere other language when you're speaking in one language. And so that inhibitory control can have an advantage on executive function, and that can be the mechanism to like dealing with the damage done by Alzheimer's disease.
So to Eric's point, we talked a lot about kind of cognitive reserve in your project and how that influences bilingualism in these neurodegenerative diseases. Can you talk a little bit about how that integrates into your disciplines and underneath your project?
Sure. So the cognitive reserve theory pretty much explains how different social factors such as education and socioeconomic status can influence the brain's ability. And bilingualism is one of the factors, such as the different social factor that I mentioned. So it can improve the brain's capacity, like I mentioned, through different mechanisms to improve brain's ability to deal with the damage done by the abnormal accumulation of the protein.
Could I ask you a little bit about the reflections paper? Was anything a surprise that you learned there, or if that's too strong a word, what do you think you really learned that was new, that wasn't obvious, as you reflected on the change in project?
So in the beginning, I only recognized the challenges that I faced. Something went wrong. So that was the only thing that I focused. So I was really struggle with what to do to improve this. But later on, through this reflection process, I could identify more different areas of the competency that I can focus on later, even my strength and weakness throughout that challenge. So it was a great opportunity to know more about myself and implying those competencies to later on improving on my professional skills in the future career.
Just sorry, I was going to chase that down one level more.
Yes.
Would you build on your strengths? Would you minimize your weaknesses? What would you do differently based on what you learned?
I think it's a combination of both.
Okay.
So strength can be applied in different contexts. So I can be more aware of my strength in different settings. So my future career will be definitely different from undergraduate settings. So I would be more aware that this is something that I have already and I can apply to different situations. But I would also improve my weaknesses, which was main challenge here. And then so that I won't make same mistakes here in my later opportunities.
Thank you.
In your studies from your research projects, you mentioned that when you have bilingual multilingualism, that it has an advantage in executive functioning. Did you find that because of that advantage, there is just an overall less instance of any type of dementia or Alzheimer's in the population in general? So if you have multilingual or bilingualism, they have less instances than someone who's monolingual?
To be honest, I think because of the limitation that I mentioned, the retrospective approach, I think there's still, it's like exact correlation between bilingual people and Alzheimer's disease. There's one increased or the other reduced down. So I can say for certain that it's a phenomenon out there, but that definitely bilingual can have a positive influence on the Alzheimer's disease. So this is one executive advantage in executive function is definitely can be one of the mechanisms to improve on dealing with that process.
Well, thank you. For the sake of time, we'll move our lunch. Thank you very much.